Tonight, you will walk beside one of history's greatest conquerors, not through the noise of battle, but through the quiet moments in between. The moments when the fire was low and the tent was still and the stars above a foreign land looked almost familiar. The moments when a young man who had been told since childhood that he was destined for something extraordinary sat alone with his thoughts and wondered what extraordinary actually felt like from the inside. There is no urgency tonight. There is nowhere you need to be. Whatever the day has asked of you, whatever it has taken or left unfinished, all of that belongs to another time. Right now, in this quiet, in this comfortable stillness, you are simply here, breathing slowly, letting the weight of everything settle down into the surface beneath you. And as it settles, as the edges of the day begin to soften and blur, you can allow your imagination to travel somewhere very far away, somewhere ancient, somewhere that exists now only in the amber of history and the patient pages of old books. We are going to a place called Macedonia, and the time is a long time ago. More than 2,000 years ago, when the world was organized very differently, when the edges of the known earth were not yet fixed, when it was still possible for a single person to walk to the end of everything that was understood and keep walking into the unknown. When the world was still young enough that someone could genuinely discover it. And somewhere in that world, in a kingdom on the northern edge of ancient Greece, a child was born. A child whose name would be spoken for the rest of human history, whose story would be told and retold and wondered about across every century that followed. A child who would grow into a young man and then into a conqueror, and then into something that history still struggles to categorize because he was so many things at once, and because the life he lived was so compressed and so vivid and so strange that it still seems almost impossible that it was only one lifetime. His name was Alexander, and this is his story, told slowly, told gently, told the way it deserves to be told in the quiet hours of the night. Let yourself settle a little more deeply now. Let your breathing find its own easy rhythm. In and out, slow and soft. There is nothing to follow or understand or remember. You are simply listening, simply drifting, simply letting the story carry you the way a slow river carries a leaf, gently, without effort, toward somewhere peaceful. The kingdom of Macedonia, in the time before Alexander was born, was a place of extraordinary energy and ambition. It sat at the northern edge of the Greek world, bordered by mountains and forests and the wide Aegean sky. The Greeks to the south sometimes looked at Macedonia with a kind of sophisticated condescension. They considered it rough, undeveloped, not quite part of the refined civilization they had built in the city-states of Athens and Corinth and Sparta. But Macedonia had something the city-states often lacked: a unified kingdom, a warrior culture that had been hardened by generations of border conflict, and a line of kings who were slowly, steadily building something that would change everything. Alexander's father was Philip II, and Philip was, by any measure, a remarkable man. A king who had transformed Macedonia from a relatively minor northern kingdom into the most powerful military force in the Greek world. A man of extraordinary cunning and patience and vision. A man who could see, across decades, where the current of history was flowing, and who had the will and the skill to place himself and his kingdom in exactly the right position to ride that current to dominance. Philip had spent time as a young man in Thebes, the great Greek city famous for its sacred band, an elite military unit of paired warriors whose loyalty to each other was the foundation of their extraordinary battlefield effectiveness. In Thebes, Philip watched and learned. He absorbed everything he could about Greek military tactics, about the use of cavalry, about the organization of infantry into formations that could hold their shape under pressure. And when he returned to Macedonia and eventually became king, he built an army using everything he had learned. An army organized around a formation that would become one of the most famous in military history, the Macedonian phalanx. But we are not here to catalogue tactics and formations. We are here to tell a story, a human story. And the human story of Alexander begins not with his father's army or his father's campaigns, but with a much quieter scene, with a woman sitting in a palace in the city of Pella on a warm summer evening, waiting for the birth of her first child. Her name was Olympias, and she was, by all accounts, a woman of remarkable intensity. She came from Epirus, a kingdom to the west of Macedonia, and she brought with her the customs and beliefs of her homeland, including a deep devotion to certain mystery cults, religious practices that involved ecstatic ritual and serpents, and a direct relationship with the divine that was very different from the more formal religious observances of the Macedonian court. She was passionate and fierce and loving, and at times frightening in her certainty. She believed with absolute conviction that her son was not merely the child of Philip of Macedonia. She believed he was the child of something divine, the child of Zeus himself, or perhaps of Zeus in the form of a serpent. This belief she carried like a lamp inside her, and she passed its light to her son so thoroughly that he spent his entire life partly convinced it might be true. The night Alexander was born, in the summer of a year we now call 356 before the Common Era, there were stories told about signs and omens, stories about lightning striking the temple of the great goddess at Ephesus on the same night, stories about dreams and flames. Whether any of these things actually happened does not entirely matter. What matters is that they were told, that from the very beginning of his life, the people around Alexander understood that they were in the presence of something unusual, something that required a different kind of story than ordinary lives required. He was a beautiful child, by the accounts that have survived, fair-skinned, with a complexion that flushed easily, eyes of different colors, one dark and one lighter, which gave his gaze an unsettling intensity, hair that was described as tawny, the color of a lion. He was small for his age and physically compact, but his energy was overwhelming. He moved quickly and thought quickly, and had, from the very beginning, a ferocious appetite for attention and for excellence. He wanted to be the best at everything he tried. This was not a quiet ambition, it was loud and urgent and sometimes painful. When he heard that his father had won a military victory, he did not celebrate. He worried. He worried that his father would conquer everything before he, Alexander, had a chance to conquer anything himself. When other boys were satisfied with a good performance, Alexander was already thinking about how to do better. This quality, this relentless hunger for the exceptional, would define his entire life. It would carry him to heights that no one in history had yet reached, and it would also, in the end, consume him. But that is later. For now he is a child in a palace, in a kingdom, in a world that was slowly preparing to produce exactly the man that world needed. Or perhaps the man it feared. Perhaps both. Let your imagination settle into the hills of Macedonia now. Imagine the landscape, the mountains in the distance, blue with haze on summer mornings, the wide plains where horses grazed in herds, the smell of pine forests after rain, the sound of wind across the uplands carrying something that felt like possibility. This was the world Alexander breathed in as a boy, the world that shaped the way he saw everything that followed. No matter how far he traveled, no matter what deserts he crossed, or what cities he conquered, some part of him always carried the particular quality of light in a Macedonian afternoon. He learned to ride horses very young. Horses were central to Macedonian culture, central to the identity of the aristocracy, central to the way war was fought and the way status was expressed. A Macedonian nobleman who could not ride well was hardly a nobleman at all. Alexander rode the way he did everything, with total commitment, with a physical fearlessness that sometimes alarmed the adults around him. He and the horse seemed to communicate in some language that existed below words, below thought, in the pure vocabulary of movement and balance and mutual trust. There is a story about a horse, one of the most famous small stories from Alexander's childhood, and one that tells you everything you need to know about who he was even then. A horse dealer came to Philip's court with a magnificent black stallion to sell. The horse was enormous and wild and beautiful, and Philip's men tried to ride him and could not. The horse threw every rider who approached him. He was unmanageable, and the court was about to send him away when Alexander, who was perhaps 12 or 13 years old, asked to be allowed to try. The adults were amused or irritated, depending on their patience. Philip apparently told his son that if he failed to ride the horse, he would pay the price of the animal out of his own money. This was meant to be a lesson in humility. But Alexander had noticed something that the adults had not. He had seen that the horse was terrified of his own shadow. Every time his shadow moved before him, the horse panicked and reared. So Alexander turned the horse to face the sun, eliminating the shadow, and then spoke to the animal quietly, and then very gently, very confidently, mounted him. And the horse carried him, smoothly, easily, as though they had known each other for years. Alexander rode the length of the field and returned, and the court apparently erupted in something between amazement and relief, and Philip, according to the story, wept. Not from sadness, from a complicated emotion that was partly pride and partly something else. He told his son that Macedonia was too small for him, that Alexander would need to find a bigger kingdom. The horse's name was Bucephalus, the ox head, a name that may have referred to a brand on his flank or to the massiveness of his head. And Bucephalus would be with Alexander for most of his conquering life. They would cross 3 continents together. They would charge through dozens of battles. They would be the living symbol of Alexander's relationship to power, to the untamable, to the wild thing that could be understood if you paid close enough attention. But a boy, even a remarkable boy, needs more than a horse. He needs a teacher, and Alexander was fortunate in a way that few human beings in history have been fortunate in the teacher he received. When Alexander was approximately 13 years old, his father Philip hired a philosopher to educate the prince. Not just any philosopher, the greatest philosopher in the world at that time. Perhaps the greatest philosopher who has ever lived, a man from the city of Stagira in Macedonia, who had studied for 20 years at Plato's academy in Athens, and had, by the time Philip called him, developed a mind of such extraordinary range and precision that it makes the modern mind ache to contemplate it. His name was Aristotle. Aristotle would teach Alexander for 3 years. They met at a place called Mieza, a quiet grove outside the city of Pella, full of shaded walks and gardens, a place that felt designed for the unhurried exchange of ideas. Aristotle had a habit of teaching while walking. His school in Athens would later be called the Lyceum, and his followers would be called peripatetics, the walkers, because of this habit. And so the great philosopher and the young prince walked together through the gardens of Mieza, and the world of ideas opened before Alexander the way a landscape opens before a traveler coming over a high pass. What did Aristotle teach him? Everything. The question is almost too broad to answer, because Aristotle's mind contained almost everything there was to know in the 4th century before the Common Era. He taught Alexander philosophy, the love and pursuit of wisdom. He taught him rhetoric, the art of speaking persuasively and clearly. He taught him medicine, which Alexander would practice throughout his life, sometimes treating his own soldiers' wounds with his own hands with a confidence and competence that astonished people. He taught him literature, particularly the works of Homer, which Alexander already loved and which would remain his most constant intellectual companion for the rest of his life. He taught him geography, or what was known of it, the shapes of continents and the courses of rivers and the names of peoples living in distant places. He taught him biology, zoology, botany, the patient observation of living things that Aristotle was turning into a new kind of systematic knowledge. Imagine those mornings, the light coming through the garden in long slanted shafts, the smell of flowers and cool earth, 2 figures walking slowly along a gravelled path, one old and large and deliberate in his speech, the other young and quick and always slightly ahead of himself, always running toward the next idea before the previous one was fully absorbed. The old man's voice measured and careful, the young man's voice eager, full of questions that were sometimes brilliant and sometimes impatient. They must have disagreed sometimes. Aristotle believed in the moderate life, the life of balance and proportion and staying within limits. Alexander believed in the unlimited, in pushing every boundary until it moved or broke. Aristotle believed that non-Greeks were natural inferiors, natural slaves. Alexander would spend his life proving that this was wrong, though he might not have known it at the time. But they also must have illuminated each other in ways that neither fully understood. Aristotle gave Alexander a framework for thinking about the world, a set of tools for ordering and understanding experience, and Alexander gave Aristotle something too, though this is less often discussed. He gave Aristotle access to the world. As Alexander's campaigns moved into Asia, He sent back to Aristotle botanical specimens and zoological observations and geographical information from places that no Greek had ever seen. The greatest philosopher and the greatest conqueror fed each other's work in ways that still echo through the history of human knowledge. There was a particular gift that Aristotle gave to Alexander that deserves its own moment of quiet attention. He gave him an annotated copy of Homer's Iliad. The Iliad, that ancient poem about the Trojan War, about the wrath of Achilles and the cost of glory, and the way that war reveals the very best and the very worst of what human beings are capable of. Alexander received this annotated copy and carried it with him in a special chest that also held a dagger for the rest of his life. He slept with it under his pillow. He knew large portions of it by heart. He read it when he could not sleep, when the weight of decision pressed down on him in the small hours of the night. His particular hero from the Iliad was Achilles, and this tells you something important about Alexander. He did not choose Odysseus, the clever one, the survivor, the man who found his way home through cunning and patience. He chose Achilles, the beautiful, the doomed, the one who chose a short, glorious life over a long, ordinary one. The one for whom glory was not a means to an end, but the end itself. The one who burned so brightly that he could not possibly burn for long. This choice was not accidental. It was a prophecy that Alexander was making about himself. Let your body grow a little heavier now. Let your muscles soften toward the surface beneath you. The story is still unfolding, slowly, gently, like smoke rising in a still room. There is no hurry. The night is long, and the story is rich, and you can follow it at whatever depth feels comfortable. Alexander grew. The years at Mieza with Aristotle ended, and he returned to the court of his father, now a young man in his mid-teens, carrying in his mind the extraordinary gift of a world-class education, and in his body the extraordinary energy of a person who has never yet found his limits. He was handsome in the way that certain people are handsome when their inner life is very strong, the face reflecting the intensity behind it, the eyes carrying something that made other people want to look at them, and also slightly afraid of what they saw there. He was placed in positions of responsibility early. Philip was often away on campaign, and the running of Macedonia fell, in those periods, to the queen Olympias, and increasingly to Alexander himself. He was given a seal and authority. He was trusted with decisions. He handled them well, with a maturity that surprised people who expected a teenager and found something older and more considered. There is a story about a rebellion from a tribe on the northern border while Philip was away. Alexander dealt with it. He led a campaign, captured the tribal stronghold, renamed it Alexandropolis, which means City of Alexander, and settled Macedonians in it. He was 16. The first city to bear his name was founded before he had grown a beard. He fought alongside his father at the Battle of Chaeronea when Alexander was 18 years old. This was the battle that decided the fate of the Greek city-states. Philip had been moving steadily toward dominance of the Greek world, and the Greeks had finally organized themselves enough to resist under the leadership of Athens and Thebes. The two sides met on a plain in Boeotia, and Alexander commanded the Macedonian cavalry on the left wing, and when the moment came, he led his horsemen through a gap in the Greek line and struck the Theban sacred band from the side. The sacred band, that legendary unit of paired warriors who had never been defeated, was destroyed. The battle was over. Philip had conquered Greece, and his teenage son had played a decisive role in the victory. You can imagine them that evening, standing on the battlefield in the fading light, looking at what they had done. Philip and Alexander, father and son, two men who loved each other and competed with each other and needed each other in ways that neither of them could fully articulate. That evening must have been complicated. The victory was shared, the glory was shared, and for Philip, there must have been something quietly painful about sharing the glory with a son who was already, at 18, beginning to cast a shadow. The relationship between Philip and Alexander was not simple. Few relationships between powerful fathers and brilliant sons ever are. Philip was proud of Alexander and threatened by him. He admired him and resented the way that everyone in the court already seemed to be orienting themselves toward the future, toward the young man rather than the king. He loved him with the complicated love of a father who sees himself in his child, and is not entirely comfortable with what he sees. And then there was the marriage. Philip married again. He had been married before, many times, as Macedonian kings did, building political alliances through matrimony. But this particular marriage was different. He married a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra, the niece of one of his generals. And at the wedding feast, the bride's uncle made a toast in which he expressed the hope that this marriage would produce a legitimate heir for Macedonia. The implication was clear. Alexander, whose mother was Epirote and foreign, might not be considered fully legitimate. The new wife's child, fully Macedonian on both sides, would be. Alexander threw his cup at the man. Philip drew his sword and lurched toward his son, drunk and furious, and stumbled and fell. Alexander looked at his father on the floor and said, in words that were remembered and repeated, that here was the man who was planning to cross from Europe to Asia and yet could not cross from one couch to another. He left. He took his mother and went to Epirus. The court of Macedonia was divided. Father and son were estranged, but the estrangement did not last long. Philip needed Alexander. Alexander, despite his anger, needed his father. Mutual friends intervened, messages were exchanged, and Alexander returned to Pella. The relationship was repaired on the surface, though something had shifted underneath. The wound was papered over. It did not heal. And then Philip was dead. He was assassinated at the wedding of his daughter in the theatre at Aigai, the ancient ceremonial capital of Macedonia. He walked into the theatre before the guests, wanting to demonstrate his confidence, his accessibility, his lack of fear. And a young man named Pausanias, who had a personal grievance against the king, stepped forward and drove a sword into him. Philip died there, on the floor of the theatre, surrounded by his court and his family and all the plans he had made for a world he would not live to conquer. Alexander was 20 years old. The circumstances of the assassination were murky and have remained murky ever since. Was Pausanias acting alone? Was there a conspiracy? Were the Persians involved? Was Olympias? Was Alexander? No one has ever answered these questions definitively. History left them open, and they have stayed open for 2.5 millennia. What is clear is what happened in the immediate aftermath. Alexander moved with extraordinary speed. Within hours of his father's death, he had begun to consolidate power. He had the potential rivals among the Macedonian nobility eliminated. He presented himself to the army, and the army acclaimed him king. He was intelligent enough to know that hesitation in those first hours would be fatal, and he did not hesitate. He was 20 years old, and he was king of Macedonia. Let yourself breathe with the story for a moment. Let the images settle. The theatre at Aigai, the floor, the sudden silence after the violence, and then a young man stepping forward, taking the weight of an entire kingdom onto his 20-year-old shoulders and carrying it without bending. There must have been fear underneath the confidence. There must have been grief for his father, complicated and mixed with other feelings, but real nonetheless. There must have been the particular sensation of a future that had been approaching for years, suddenly arriving all at once, all the weight of the possible becoming actual in a single morning. But he carried it, and he carried it immediately, without pause. That was Alexander. The first challenge was the Greek city-states. When they heard that Philip was dead and his young, untested son had taken the throne, several of them saw an opportunity. Thebes and Athens made preparations to reassert their independence. Why should they submit to a 20-year-old? What had he done? They did not know him. He was barely old enough to be taken seriously. Alexander moved south with his army so quickly that the Greek cities were astonished. They had been preparing for a campaign season, for a slow military build-up that would give them time to organize. Instead, Alexander appeared on their borders before they had fully understood that he was coming. He marched at a pace that soldiers of the time would have considered extraordinary. He covered distances that should have taken weeks in days. He was at Thermopylae before anyone expected him. The Greeks reconsidered their resistance. The Thessalians submitted. Athens and the other city-states negotiated. Alexander was recognized as the leader of the Hellenic League, the coalition of Greek states that his father had organized, and appointed general of the Greek forces for the campaign against Persia that Philip had been planning. He was 20, and he was already the most powerful man in Europe. But before he could look east, he had to look north. There were always threats on the Macedonian frontiers, tribes that tested the kingdom's borders when they sensed weakness. Alexander spent the next year and a half conducting lightning campaigns in Thrace and Illyria against peoples whose names most of us no longer know, in territories that are now Bulgaria and Albania and the countries around them. These campaigns were exercises in sustained energy and tactical creativity. He fought in mountains and forests and river valleys, adapting his approach to every new terrain, solving military problems that had no obvious solutions, keeping his army moving and fed and confident through conditions that would have broken a lesser general. And then came the news from Greece. Thebes had rebelled. They had killed a Macedonian garrison and declared independence. Other Greek cities were wavering. If Thebes succeeded, the entire Greek coalition that Philip had built would collapse. Alexander made another of the swift, marching decisions that would become his signature. He moved south again, covering enormous distances in days. He appeared before Thebes before the city had fully organized its defenses. He offered terms. The Thebans refused. The battle was swift. Alexander's army broke into the city. And then, in a decision that was brutal and deliberate and calculated, Alexander made an example of Thebes. The city was razed. The population was sold into slavery. The temples and the house of the poet Pindar, whom Alexander admired, were spared. But almost everything else was destroyed. The effect on the rest of Greece was immediate and total. The rebellion collapsed. Athens, which had been on the edge of joining the revolt, sent a terrified embassy to Alexander expressing regret and loyalty. Alexander accepted. He needed Athens. Athens had the navy and the intellectual prestige and the symbolic weight that his campaign in the east would require. But first he had to let the enormity of what he had done at Thebes settle over the Greek world. It settled heavily. No one doubted anymore that the young man who had replaced Philip was capable of ruthlessness. No one doubted that he would pay a price for it himself, in the form of guilt later. But that was later. He spent the winter in Macedonia, preparing for the greatest enterprise any Greek had ever attempted. The invasion of the Persian Empire, the campaign against the Achaemenid kings, who had, more than 100 years before Alexander's time, twice invaded Greece and been twice repelled. The revenge for those invasions, or at least the pursuit of glory that the idea of revenge conveniently justified. The opening of the entire vast Eastern world to Greek ambition. He was 21, and he was getting ready to cross into Asia. The preparations were meticulous. Alexander was not only a brilliant improviser in the field, he was also a careful planner when time allowed. He organized his supplies, his logistics, his finances. He consulted oracles. He made religious offerings at the sacred sites. He paid his debts generously, distributing the royal estates and revenues to ensure that the men he was leaving behind were loyal and provided for. One of his advisors apparently asked him what he was keeping for himself. He replied, "Hope." In the spring of 334, he crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia, that had been crossed in both directions by armies and traders and wanderers for centuries, that in Greek mythology was the place where the boundary between the known world and the unknown world was crossed. He had approximately 37,000 soldiers with him: infantry, cavalry, engineers, administrators, scholars, court officials. A city on the march. Before he did anything else, he stopped at a place called Troy. He visited the ruins of the ancient city, or what was believed to be those ruins, where the Trojan War of the Iliad had been fought. He ran the course that the hero Achilles was said to have run in honor of his dead companion Patroclus. He made offerings at the tomb that was said to be Achilles' tomb. He called Achilles happy for having found in Homer a great poet to celebrate his glory. And then he turned east, toward everything that was waiting. Let the landscape of Asia Minor open before your imagination now, slowly, the way landscapes open when you travel them from a great height and slowly descend. The mountains, the river valleys, the cities. The Persian administrative empire that stretched from the Aegean coast all the way to the borders of India, organized into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a Persian-appointed official. An empire that had lasted for 200 years, that was the largest political entity the ancient world had yet produced, an empire that had seemed, to the Greeks, like an almost natural force, something too vast and too entrenched to be fundamentally challenged. Alexander was about to fundamentally challenge it. The first major battle came quickly, at a river called the Granicus in what is now northwestern Turkey. The Persian satraps had gathered a cavalry force and positioned it on the far bank of the river. The Granicus was fast-moving and the opposite bank was steep, and Alexander's senior officers advised caution, advised waiting, advised a flanking maneuver rather than a direct assault across the water. Alexander crossed the river in the face of the Persian cavalry. The battle was fierce and close. Alexander was nearly killed. A Persian nobleman slashed at him with a scimitar and cut off part of his helmet crest, and was in the act of delivering a second, fatal blow when another Macedonian officer intervened and cut the Persian down. Alexander's scalp was cut, not seriously but closely. He came that close to ending at the beginning. But the Macedonian cavalry prevailed. The Persian force broke. The satraps fled or died. The path into Asia Minor was open. Alexander marched south and west, liberating the Greek cities of the Aegean coast from Persian rule, presenting himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror, reinstating democratic governments where Persian-appointed tyrants had ruled. He was conducting a war of liberation and a war of conquest simultaneously, depending on how you looked at it and whose perspective you took, and this ambiguity would characterize his entire campaign. He arrived at a city called Gordium, in the center of what is now Turkey. In Gordium, there was a famous wagon tied to a post with an extraordinarily complex knot, the Gordian Knot. The legend said that whoever could undo this knot would rule all of Asia. Many had tried and failed. The knot was too complex, too tightly bound for any conventional approach to succeed. Alexander looked at the knot for a while. Then he drew his sword and cut it. Whether this story is literally true is disputed by historians. Some ancient sources say he pulled out a pin that secured the post and slid the rope off. But the image of the cut is the one that survives in memory, and perhaps it survives because it captures something true about Alexander's approach to problems. He did not accept the terms in which a problem was presented if those terms were artificial constraints. He found a way through or around the convention, and he moved on. He was 21 years old in Gordium. The East was before him, and Darius III, the great king of Persia, was assembling an enormous army. The meeting between Alexander and Darius would define the next 3 years. Darius was everything a king was supposed to be in the Persian tradition. Tall, extraordinarily handsome, of impeccable royal lineage. He had the full resources of the largest empire in the world at his disposal. He had elephant corps and scythed chariots and cavalry from every corner of his vast kingdom. And he had, in the abstract accounting of military power, an overwhelming advantage. But abstractions are not battles, and battles are fought in specific places, under specific conditions, by specific people. And Alexander was not an abstraction. The first great confrontation between Alexander and Darius came at a place called Issus, on the narrow coastal plain where the mountains of what is now southern Turkey come close to the sea. Darius had positioned his enormous army at a different location, expecting Alexander to come by a different route. Alexander outmaneuvered him. When the two armies finally faced each other at Issus, the narrow plain worked against Darius's advantage in numbers. His enormous army could not fully deploy. The wings overlapped the narrowness of the terrain. The battle was violent and decisive. Alexander led his cavalry in the characteristic diagonal charge that had become his signature. He was always attacking the center of the enemy command structure, always trying to find and destroy the head of the opposing army, believing that if the head fell, the body would follow. At Issus, Darius was in the center, in a great war chariot. The Macedonian cavalry broke through the Persian line and drove toward the Persian king. And Darius turned his chariot and fled. The King of Kings, the ruler of the greatest empire the world had known, fled from the battlefield. It was an act that would define him forever after, in the way that public acts under pressure always define people. His army, seeing him flee, collapsed. The Persian force was destroyed. and in the camp that Darius had left behind in his haste, Alexander found Darius's family, his wife, his mother, his daughters. They were, in the conventions of the time, prizes of war. They were expecting to be treated as such. They were terrified. Alexander went to them. He told them, through interpreters, that they had nothing to fear, that Darius was alive, that he, Alexander, would treat them with respect and dignity, that the queen mother, Sysigambis, would be treated as a queen, not as a captive. He kept this promise for the rest of his life. Sysigambis, Darius's mother, apparently came to regard Alexander almost as a son. She learned Greek. She admired him. When she eventually heard, years later, of Alexander's death, she turned her face to the wall and refused food, and died a few days afterward. This story of Alexander's treatment of Darius's family is one of the most frequently told stories about him, and it is told because it reveals something that the battlefield scenes cannot: the care, the capacity for generosity, the understanding that power exercised without humanity was eventually self-defeating. He was capable of terrible things. He would demonstrate that at other points in his story. But he was also capable of this. Let the story breathe for a moment. Feel the quality of the night around you, the slow drift of your breathing, the comfortable weight of your body. The story continues, slow and rich, like a river in flat country. No urgency, just the flowing. After Issus, Alexander did not chase Darius. He turned south. He had a plan that his senior advisors sometimes found frustrating in its refusal to take the obvious path. Instead of pursuing the Persian king and delivering the killing blow while the Persians were still in disarray, Alexander moved to secure the coastline. He understood something that his cavalry-oriented officers sometimes did not fully appreciate: that the Persian navy was still intact, that as long as the Persian navy controlled the sea lanes, his supply lines were vulnerable, that the way to defeat the Persian navy was not to fight it at sea, where his own navy was weaker, but to capture every port along the coast and deny the Persian ships their bases. He would win the sea battle on land. The strategy was methodical and brilliant, and also, in places, very hard. The city of Tyre, on its island just off the coast of what is now Lebanon, refused to surrender. It was considered impregnable, an island city connected to the mainland only by a narrow causeway, with massive walls and a strong garrison and the full resources of a major Phoenician trading city behind it. Alexander besieged it. The siege lasted 7 months. He built a causeway from the mainland to the island, an engineering project of extraordinary ambition that his own engineers initially told him was impossible. He assembled siege engines. He attacked from the sea, from land, from every available angle. The Tyrians resisted with extraordinary courage and creativity, counterattacking, destroying his siege towers, sinking his ships, fighting until the walls were broken and the street fighting was brutal and the city was taken. 7 months, a young man who did not like to wait, who preferred the cavalry charge to the siege, who was most alive in movement, sitting outside a city for 7 months and driving the operation with a patience that sat alongside his impatience, like something carefully learned rather than naturally felt. Tyre fell. Alexander moved on, south to Egypt. Egypt, the oldest civilization in the world by the reckoning of the ancient Greeks, a land of extraordinary antiquity and extraordinary strangeness, full of monuments that made even the wonders of Greece seem recent. The pyramids at Giza were already ancient when Alexander arrived, more than 2,000 years old. The Egyptians had their own gods, their own writing, their own understanding of time and eternity that was so different from the Greek understanding that the two were barely commensurable. And the Egyptians, who had been under Persian rule for generations and who had found that rule heavy and contemptuous of their traditions, received Alexander as a liberator. He was welcomed. He visited Memphis, the ancient capital. He went to the oracle of the god Amun at the Siwa oasis, deep in the Libyan desert, several days' journey from the Nile. The journey to Siwa was difficult. The desert crossing was dangerous, disorienting, exhausting. According to the stories, Alexander and his party became lost and were guided by ravens or serpents, depending on which version you read. Eventually, they reached the oasis, with its gardens and springs, and the ancient temple of the oracle. What Alexander asked at the oracle is not recorded. He said afterward that he had received a satisfactory answer. The priests, according to some accounts, greeted him as the son of Ammon. In Egypt, the pharaohs were considered the sons of the gods by nature. But Alexander was not an Egyptian pharaoh. He was a Macedonian conqueror. The greeting may have been a formal courtesy, or it may have been something the priests genuinely believed, or it may have been something Alexander needed to hear and arranged to hear. We cannot know, but we know what it meant to Alexander. It confirmed, in some deep place within him, the identity his mother had been telling him about since childhood. The son of a god, the destined one, the figure who was not bound by ordinary human limitations because he did not come from merely ordinary human origins. Whether he literally believed this, or whether he used it as a political and psychological tool, or whether the distinction between genuine belief and useful conviction simply did not apply to him the way it would to most people, is one of the genuinely unanswerable questions of his life. He founded a city in Egypt. He was very fond of founding cities. He would found many cities in his years of campaigning, and most of them he named after himself. Alexandria in Egypt, which he placed at a site on the Nile Delta near a small fishing village, would become one of the most important cities in the ancient world. It would grow into the intellectual center of the Hellenistic world. Its library would become the greatest repository of knowledge in antiquity. Its harbor would become one of the busiest in the Mediterranean. Its mix of Greek and Egyptian and Jewish and later Christian populations would make it a place of extraordinary intellectual and religious ferment for centuries. He paced out the foundations himself. He could not find the white chalk that was normally used to mark building lines, so he used grain from his army's supplies. A flock of birds descended and ate the grain. His soothsayers interpreted this as a favorable omen, that the city would nourish many peoples. He accepted this interpretation. He moved on. The reckoning with Darius was still to come. While Alexander had been campaigning in Phoenicia and Egypt, Darius had been rebuilding his army. He had been gathering forces from across the empire, drawing on resources that Alexander did not have access to, constructing a new military instrument that would be larger and more carefully prepared than the force that had broken at Issus. Alexander moved east, back into Asia, across the Syrian desert, across the Tigris and Euphrates, into the heartland of the Persian Empire. The final confrontation would come on a broad plain at a place called Gaugamela, near the modern city of Mosul in northern Iraq. Darius had chosen this site deliberately because the plain was wide and flat, giving his enormous army room to deploy fully, giving his scythed chariots and war elephants room to maneuver. He had even had the ground leveled to remove any terrain irregularities that might interrupt the charge of his vehicles. He was doing everything right. He was fighting the battle as rationally and as carefully as a man of his experience and resources could fight it. Alexander studied the Persian position. His senior general Parmenion, who had served Philip before him and who carried a lifetime of military experience and careful judgment, advised a night attack. The Persian forces were so large that attacking in daylight was dangerous. At night, the coordination problems that an army of that size had would be multiplied, and Alexander could take advantage of the confusion. Alexander declined. He would not steal the victory, he said. He would not win by darkness and confusion. He would win in the daylight, looking Darius in the eye. There is something both admirable and revealing about this decision. The admirable part is the directness, the refusal of the indirect advantage, the confidence that he could win on open terms. The revealing part is the need for the glory to be unambiguous. He needed the victory to be seen. He needed it to be complete. He needed there to be no possible qualification of the achievement. This was not merely tactical preference. This was his character expressing itself in military terms. He slept soundly the night before the battle. This was noted at the time and has been noted ever since. His officers woke him with difficulty in the morning. When Parmenion apparently expressed wonder at this ability to sleep on the eve of such a battle, Alexander reportedly said something to the effect that the thing he had been seeking was now within reach. The great game was almost over. The anxiety of the pursuit was ending. There was nothing left to worry about. Gaugamela was the most carefully contested of the three major battles between Alexander and Darius. The Persian army was vast and well organized, and the commanders knew what Alexander was likely to do. But what they could not fully prepare for was the speed and the precision with which he executed it. He had drilled his army to maintain formation, even under the kind of pressure that usually broke formations apart. The Macedonian phalanx could bend and flex without breaking. The cavalry could charge and withdraw, and charge again, in ways that most cavalry of the era could not manage. Alexander watched the battle unfold, watching for the gap. Always watching for the gap, the moment when the movement of the battle created an opening through which a determined cavalry charge could reach the center. Waiting with the patience of a hunter who knows that patience is the essential tool, and that moving too early would be worse than not moving at all. The gap appeared. Alexander went through it. He was aimed at Darius. The story played out as it had at Issus, with the critical difference that at Issus there had been a physical near miss, a moment when the two rulers of the world had been genuinely close to each other. At Gaugamela, the cavalry broke through and headed for the Persian king, and Darius, looking at what was coming, made the same decision he had made at Issus. He fled, and the battle, the Persian Empire, the world, ended for him. His army collapsed. Not all at once, not everywhere. The fighting in some parts of the field continued and was fierce. But the king had fled. The center was gone. The coordinated resistance was impossible without the coordinating figure. The Macedonians pushed through everywhere they could, and by the end of that long and exhausting day, Gaugamela was a Macedonian victory of overwhelming proportions. Alexander rode in pursuit of Darius, but Darius had too great a head start and too fast a horse. He escaped, for the time being, into the Persian heartland, into the provinces that had not yet been touched by the Macedonian advance. Looking for some place to reorganize, to find allies, to begin again. But some things, once broken, cannot be reorganized from. The flight from Gaugamela broke something in Darius's authority that could not be repaired. The people who owed him loyalty looked at the great king who had run from battle twice, and the loyalty began to loosen. Alexander entered Babylon. The ancient city, one of the greatest in the world, opened its gates and welcomed him. He made offerings at the temple of Marduk, the chief Babylonian god. He ordered the restoration of the temples that the Persian king Xerxes had damaged decades before. He was presenting himself, as he always did, as the restorer rather than the destroyer, the liberator rather than the conqueror. Whether this self-presentation was genuine or strategic or both is again a question without a simple answer. He moved on to Susa, another of the great Persian capitals, where the treasury was. The treasure of the Persian Empire was almost incomprehensible in its scale. Tens of thousands of talents of gold and silver, wealth accumulated over generations of conquest and taxation, a material expression of the power of the Achaemenid dynasty that made Alexander's own resources look modest. He distributed some of it to his men. He used enormous amounts to fund his continuing campaign. He sent large quantities back to Greece and Macedonia, and he kept enough to sustain an enterprise that was going to become much larger and much more expensive than even he had yet fully imagined. Then came Bucephalus. Bucephalus was the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, not the administrative center, not the trading hub, but the place where the Persian kings held the great ritual gatherings of their empire, where the New Year's celebrations took place, where the delegations from every subject nation came to pay tribute, where the identity and the glory of the Achaemenid dynasty was most fully expressed in stone and gold and paint. It was one of the most beautiful and most spectacular architectural complexes in the world. Alexander burned it. He burned it after his army had been in the city for several months. The circumstances are debated. One tradition says that a courtesan named Thais, who was the companion of Alexander's general Ptolemy, suggested at a drunken party that Alexander should burn the palace as revenge for the Persian burning of Athens more than a century before. That Alexander lit the first torch, that his companions, drunk and swept up in the moment, followed. Another tradition suggests the burning was deliberate and political, a calculated symbolic act that declared the war of revenge against Persia officially complete, and simultaneously destroyed the physical symbol of the dynasty he was replacing. Whatever the real sequence of events, Alexander is reported to have expressed regret afterward, to have looked at the smoking ruins in the sober light of morning and wished it undone, or at least to have shown something that looked like regret, which may or may not be the same thing. Bucephalus was the point in Alexander's story where the historian begins to see the first signs of the shadows that would darken his later years. The first sign that the young man who had controlled himself so carefully, who had treated his captives with generosity and his allies with respect, who had managed the almost impossibly complex demands of leading an international army through foreign territory with remarkable sophistication, was beginning to bend under the weight of his own success. He was still only 26 years old. Let your breathing slow a little more. The night is deep around you. The story is moving into its middle passages now, the long years in the East, where everything became more complicated and more strange, and the edges of the world as Alexander knew it were left further and further behind. He was still pursuing Darius. The Persian king was moving east through the mountain passes of what is now Iran, still trying to find a position of safety from which to rebuild his authority. But his own satraps, his own governors and generals, had begun to do their own calculations. They saw a king who had fled from battle twice, who had lost battle after battle to this impossible young Macedonian, who was leading a shrinking remnant of what had once been the greatest army in the world toward a horizon that kept moving back. Darius was captured by his own men, specifically by a satrap named Bessus, who held authority over the province of Bactria in what is now Afghanistan. Bessus arrested Darius and held him as a prisoner, presumably intending to use him as a bargaining piece, or perhaps planning to claim the throne himself. When Alexander learned that Darius was a prisoner rather than a fugitive, he moved with even greater urgency. He drove his cavalry in a pursuit march of extraordinary speed, covering distances in a night and a day that should have taken much longer, changing horses when the animals faltered, pressing on. He was trying to reach Darius while Darius was still alive. He almost succeeded. He found Darius dying, abandoned by the road in a baggage wagon, left behind by Bessus when the advance grew too fast to keep a prisoner. Darius had been stabbed. He was dying, or already dead when Alexander arrived. There is a story, probably embellished, but perhaps carrying something true, that Alexander reached Darius while he still breathed, that he covered the dying king with his own cloak, that Darius thanked him, through the strange medium of a dying man's gratitude, for the courtesy of a stranger who had spent years trying to destroy him, that Darius asked only that Alexander take revenge on those who had betrayed him. Alexander buried Darius with the honors due to a great king. He arranged a royal funeral. He declared that the murder of Darius was a crime against all right order, not a victory for himself. Bessus, who had committed the murder in the hope of making himself king, was eventually captured and executed in a way that made clear the severity with which Alexander viewed the betrayal of a legitimate ruler. There was something consistent in Alexander about legitimate authority. He had been raised to believe in the divine right of kings, in the sacred nature of the royal office. He could overthrow a king in open battle, because that was the settlement of competing claims through the ultimate test of force. But to murder a captured king was something different. It offended some deep principle in him. When he eventually stood at the place where Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, was buried, he was so disturbed to find the tomb had been disturbed that he ordered it restored and investigated the desecration personally. He was the conqueror of everything that Cyrus had built, and he treated the memory of Cyrus with more respect than many of Cyrus's own successors had managed. Now he was the king of Persia, not just the conqueror, the king. And this created a problem that went to the heart of everything he was and everything he was trying to build. The Persian king was not merely a political figure. He was a divine or semi-divine figure. He received prostration from those who came before him. He was the center of an elaborate court ceremonial that expressed, in every gesture and every procedure, the absolute superiority of the great king to all other human beings. For his Macedonian and Greek followers, who had been raised in a tradition that valued personal dignity and the horizontal relationships between men of equal standing, prostration before a human being was an act of degradation. It was what you did before gods, not before men, even exceptional men. But for the Persians who were now his subjects, The absence of these ceremonies was also troubling. It suggested that he did not fully accept the role he had taken, that he was treating the kingship as something less than it was, that he was a conqueror rather than a king. Alexander tried to solve this with compromises. He maintained different ceremonial standards for different groups. He adopted elements of Persian dress in private while wearing Macedonian dress in public. He kept the administrative structures of the Persian Empire largely in place, appointing Persians as well as Macedonians to key positions. He encouraged his Macedonian officers to marry Persian women. He took a Persian wife himself, a princess named Roxanne from Bactria, the daughter of a local chieftain who had been his opponent and became his ally. But compromises satisfy no one fully. The Macedonians thought he was going native, betraying the culture that had made him. The Persians were never entirely certain of his full legitimacy, and in the middle, trying to hold everything together, Alexander was discovering that the hardest part of conquest was the aftermath. The hardest thing about taking a world was what to do with it once you had it. The story moves deeper east now, into territory that even the Greeks' geographical knowledge barely touched, into Bactria and Sogdiana, regions that correspond roughly to modern Afghanistan and the Central Asian republics, into landscapes of breathtaking beauty and brutal difficulty, high mountain passes and wide steppe plains, and rivers that flooded without warning, and summers that burned, and winters that froze. The campaign in Bactria and Sogdiana was different in character from what had come before. The great set-piece battles were mostly over. This was guerrilla warfare, insurgency, the kind of conflict that grinds down an army not in great decisive engagements, but in the endless, exhausting, demoralizing attrition of ambushes and raids and supply disruptions, and a population that melted away before advances and reformed behind them. Alexander adapted. He had to. The tactics that had won the pitched battles in Persia were not adequate for the mountains of Central Asia. He broke his forces into smaller units. He led raids himself, sometimes with minimal personal escort, climbing mountain passes in winter that his own officers told him were impassable. He was nearly killed several times, once seriously wounded by an arrow that punctured his lung in the fighting in what is now the Swat Valley of modern Pakistan. He was not invincible. He was never invincible. He was simply willing to accept risks that other commanders would not, to move when other commanders would pause, to demand of himself and of his men things that other commanders would not have dared demand. The cost was real, in men and horses, and in Alexander's own body, which was accumulating wounds the way old trees accumulate rings. This was also the period of the most serious domestic crises of his reign, the periods when the stress of the long campaign and the impossible demands he placed on himself began to fracture the relationships around him. There was Philotas, the son of his senior general Parmenion, accused of conspiracy. Whether the accusation was genuine or manufactured is still debated. Alexander had him tried and executed, and then, in a move that seemed to acknowledge that Parmenion, the old general who had served his father, could not be trusted once his son was dead, he had Parmenion killed too. Parmenion was in Ecbatana, far from the campaign, too far to have had any direct role in any conspiracy. But he was potentially dangerous, and Alexander, in those years, was making calculations about loyalty and danger that were becoming harder to distinguish from paranoia. There was Clytus the Black, a Macedonian officer who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, who was one of his oldest companions. At a drunken feast, Clytus quarreled with Alexander. He said things that Alexander found intolerable, about Philip's achievements compared to Alexander's, about the Persianizing of the court, about the death of men like himself who had carried Alexander on their backs across the world. Alexander, drunk and furious, and perhaps carrying wounds that went deeper than any arrow had reached, killed Clytus with a spear. And then, when he understood what he had done, he fell into the deepest remorse. He tried to kill himself and had to be restrained by his companions. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing food, unable to be consoled, doing the work of genuine self-examination that follows an act of genuine horror. It took the intervention of his philosophers and his friends over several days to bring him back to the capacity to function. He never forgot it. He carried the guilt of Clytus's death for the rest of his life. It was the wound that went deepest, because it was self-inflicted, because the man he had killed was innocent of any real offense, because it revealed to him a capacity in himself that was worse than anything his enemies had done to him. And there was the pages' conspiracy, and the execution of the philosopher Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who had accompanied the campaign as official historian and who had refused to perform prostration, and who had spoken publicly against Alexander's adoption of Persian customs. Callisthenes was implicated, perhaps genuinely, perhaps not, in a conspiracy by the royal pages, and was arrested and eventually died in custody. When Aristotle learned of this, something in the relationship between the great philosopher and his most famous student broke. They had been corresponding throughout the campaign. Aristotle had sent books and information and advice. Now there was only silence between them. The teacher and the student had traveled to places where neither could fully follow the other. Let the story carry you gently now into its deepest passages. You are not being asked to hold all of this in your mind. Let it wash over you. Let it settle somewhere below the level of conscious thought, in the way that old stories settle into us without our always knowing how. The campaign moved into India. The decision to cross the Hindu Kush and enter the Indus Valley was, by almost any rational analysis, beyond the mandate of the Greek alliance. The war of revenge against Persia was long since won. Persia was conquered. The empire was his. There was no strategic necessity to push further. His men had been marching for years. They were tired and injured and far from home. Their families were aging or dying in Macedonia and Greece. Their children were growing up without fathers. But Alexander could not stop, not because of any external compulsion, because stopping was not in his nature, because the map still showed territory beyond the current edge of the conquered, because something in him, that same something that had worried as a teenager, that his father would conquer everything before he had a chance, could not be satisfied by any boundary short of the end of the world. He believed, as the geographical knowledge of his time suggested, that the ocean lay just beyond India, that if he could push through to the Eastern Ocean, he would have reached the physical limit of the earth. He would have stood at the edge of everything. He would have done what no one before him had done, touched the ultimate boundary, and then perhaps turned back with the knowledge that he had seen all there was to see. He crossed the Hindu Kush. He crossed the Indus. He fought at the Hydaspes River against a king named Porus, the most remarkable of all his Indian opponents. Porus had elephants, and the elephants were a military problem that Macedonian soldiers had not fully faced before. The animals terrified the horses. The traditional cavalry tactics needed to be adapted. Alexander found the adaptation. He attacked at night, in a rainstorm, with his cavalry positioned to avoid direct contact with the elephants until his infantry had engaged and the battlefield was confused enough that the elephants were as dangerous to their own side as to his. The battle was long and difficult, and eventually Macedonian. Porus, fighting with great personal courage, was captured. When Porus was brought before Alexander, still bleeding, Alexander asked him how he expected to be treated. Porus answered, reportedly, that he expected to be treated like a king. Alexander made him a governor, a trusted partner in the administration of the newly conquered territory. The answer had apparently pleased him. The courage of a man who met defeat without begging for mercy was something Alexander respected, perhaps because it was something he would have demanded of himself. He pushed east, and then, at a river called the Hyphasis, which we now call the Beas, in what is now the Punjab region of India, his army stopped. They would not go further. They had been marching for more than 8 years. They had covered thousands of miles from Macedonia. They were in a country that felt utterly alien, where the rains came in quantities that made the Greek sky feel like a memory, where the forests were vast and unknown and full of creatures that had no names in Greek. They were exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, in a way that had gotten into their bones and into their dreams. They wanted to go home. Their officers petitioned Alexander. Their families were strangers. Their sons were growing up without them. They had done everything he asked. They had crossed every sea and every desert and every mountain range. They had followed him to the edge of the known world and beyond. But this was enough. They would not go further. Alexander went into his tent. He stayed there for 3 days. It was what he did when the world would not bend to his will. He withdrew. He waited. He perhaps hoped that his absence, his visible anger, would change the calculation, that the army that had always followed him would follow him once more. It did not. When he emerged, and the officers were still firm, still respectful, but still immovable, he understood. He was not willing to go forward without his army. He was not willing, could not be willing, to conquer India alone. And his army would not march. He made sacrifices. He announced that the gods had shown him signs that it was time to turn back. And he turned back. He wept. This is recorded. He wept at the Hyphasis because he could not cross it, because the world was larger than he had been given time to reach the end of, because the ocean was somewhere out there, and he would never stand at its edge and look out at the limitless water and know that he had seen everything there was to see. He was 30 years old. The return journey was not peaceful. He chose to lead his army back partly through the Makran Desert, a decision that caused tremendous suffering. The heat was extreme, the water was scarce, the sand was deep and exhausting. Thousands died, not in battle, but from thirst and heat, and the slow grinding down of bodies that had already given too much. Ancient sources suggest that a quarter of his army may not have survived the desert crossing. The decision to take this route is one of the hardest things to explain about Alexander. Was it a deliberate test, a punishment, somehow, of the army that had refused to follow him? A strategic calculation that has not survived in the records? A terrible error of judgment? It remains mysterious. He was also wounded during this period, badly. In a town called Mali, in what is now Pakistan, he led an assault over a city wall and was inside the city almost alone before his men could follow. He was hit by an arrow that punctured his chest and damaged a lung. He nearly died. His men, when they finally broke down the walls and reached him, apparently had a few minutes of genuine terror when they could not be certain whether he was alive. He survived. He always survived, until he didn't. The army reached Carmania, on the coast of what is now southern Iran. Alexander celebrated with his officers and men in a great festival. There are accounts that suggest something almost delirious about this celebration, a procession over 8 days in which the army moved slowly, stopping frequently, music playing, fires burning, food and wine in abundance, a release of the accumulated tension of years. He returned to Susa. He held a mass wedding, the famous Susa weddings, at which he and 90 of his senior officers married Persian noblewomen simultaneously. He gave them all magnificent gifts. He was trying to create the ruling class of a new kind of empire, one that would not be simply Macedonian-dominated, but genuinely fused, Greek and Persian, and everything else becoming something new over generations. He forgave debts, enormous debts that his soldiers had accumulated over the years of campaign. He paid them off from the royal treasury. It was an act of extraordinary generosity that apparently took even his most devoted followers by surprise. And then came the mutiny at Opis. His Macedonian soldiers, veterans of years of campaign, felt increasingly displaced by the Persians whom Alexander was incorporating into his army, his administration, his inner circle. They felt that they were being replaced, that the man for whom they had crossed the world was choosing Asians over the men who had followed him from Macedonia when none of this existed yet. At the town of Opis, on the Tigris River, when Alexander announced that veterans could go home, the army mutinied. They said if he was sending them home, he could take his father Ammon with him, a cutting reference to the divine paternity that Alexander sometimes claimed. It was one of the most direct challenges of his authority he had ever faced. He responded with fury, and then with something more calculated. He had 13 ringleaders arrested and executed immediately. Then he addressed the army in a speech that has come down to us in a form that may be partly authentic. In it, he reminded them of what his father Philip had done for Macedonia, and then what he himself had done, and he listed it all: the battles, the countries, the wealth, the territory. He told them that of all of them, they had the most, that he had kept none of it for himself, that he ate the same food and slept the same nights and went into the same battles, that they could all go home and they could tell everyone in Macedonia that they had abandoned their king. He went into his tent. The soldiers broke. After 2 days of waiting and silence, the veterans, apparently weeping, came to his tent and called out to him and refused to leave until he appeared and spoke with them. He relented. He came out. He embraced them. He reconciled. He held a great banquet of reconciliation at which Macedonians and Persians and others sat together, Alexander at the center, presiding over something he imagined as the feast of a new world. Let the story settle very softly now around you. You are in the late passages of a great life, the final years. Let the images come slowly and gently, like the last light before dark. He moved to Babylon, to the ancient city that had become, in effect, his administrative capital for the western parts of his empire. He had plans, enormous plans. He was always making plans. Plans for the conquest of Arabia, plans for an expedition around Africa, plans for the development of the harbors of the Persian Gulf, plans for mass irrigation projects in Mesopotamia, plans for more cities, more roads, more connections between the distant parts of what was now his empire. He had been told by the Chaldean priests of Babylon not to enter the city from the west, an omen. He tried to enter from the east instead, but the marshes were impassable, and he had to enter from the west. He was not, apparently, particularly troubled by this. He had ignored or explained away oracles before when they were inconvenient. His closest friend died, Hephaestion, who had been with him since they were children, who had been educated alongside him, who was perhaps the one person to whom Alexander had ever been fully open, fully trusting, fully himself, without the performance of kingship or divinity or conqueror. Hephaestion died in Ecbatana from what seems to have been typhoid fever, combined with his own reckless disregard of the doctor's advice to not drink wine during recovery. Alexander's grief was total. He shut himself in with the body for most of a day. He cut his hair, the ancient sign of mourning. He ordered the manes and tails of all the horses cut. He shut down the fires of the city, a Persian royal mourning custom that was also a tribute to the gravity of the loss. He launched a campaign against a mountain tribe, partly because his army needed to be occupied, and partly perhaps because he needed something to do with a grief that had nowhere else to go. He commissioned a funeral monument for Hephaestion that was to be one of the largest and most elaborate structures in the world. He applied to the oracle of Amun for permission to worship Hephaestion as a god. He never fully recovered, or perhaps more accurately, there was not enough time left for him to need to. He arrived in Babylon in the spring. He made his preparations for the Arabian campaign. He reviewed troops. He attended banquets. He made plans. And then he became ill. The illness came on after a prolonged drinking party at the house of a friend. He developed a fever. For a day or two, he continued his normal activities, bathing and resting, but still meeting with his officers, still reviewing plans. Then the fever grew worse. He was carried on a litter to the harbor to inspect ships. He managed meetings lying down, giving orders, maintaining the appearance of control. Then he could not speak. His officers filed past him, one by one, in what was clearly a farewell procession, even while he was still alive. He recognized each of them, they recorded, with a movement of his eyes, a slight raising of his head. He could not speak, but he was there, present, behind the fever and the failing body, still Alexander. In the second week of June, in the year 323 before the Common Era, in a palace in Babylon, Alexander died. He was 32 years old. He had been king of Macedonia for 13 years. He had conquered, in that time, an empire that stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Punjab, from the Black Sea to the Sahara. He had founded somewhere between 20 and 70 cities, depending on how you count them. He had led his army on a march of more than 30,000 kilometers. He had never lost a battle. He was 32 years old. When asked on his deathbed to whom he would leave his empire, he is said to have answered, "To the strongest," or possibly, "to the most worthy." The ancient Greek word could mean either or both. His generals, who would spend the next 40 years fighting each other for the pieces of what he had built, took this ambiguity as license for everything that followed. His body was taken, eventually, to Alexandria in Egypt, the city he had founded and named for himself, where it rested in a magnificent tomb for centuries. where Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and Augustus and others who came later and who understood themselves partly in Alexander's terms came to pay their respects, where it eventually was lost in the shifting sediments of history and has never been found again. He was 32 years old, and his body has been lost for 1700 years, and his story is still told. Let the story rest now, very gently, in the space between sleep and waking. Let the images soften and blur at the edges. The mountains of Macedonia, the plains of Persia, the deserts and the rivers and the cities, the face of the young man who was always running toward the horizon, always pressing for the next mountain to cross, the next river to ford, the next limit to dissolve. He was not a simple person. He was not simply good or simply great. He was complicated in the way that the most vivid people are always complicated, carrying within him contradictions that he could not entirely reconcile, wanting things that could not all be had at once, being capable of extraordinary tenderness and extraordinary cruelty, of patience and of rage, of vision and of blindness. He loved his friends with an intensity that bordered on the absolute. He missed his teacher Aristotle in ways he probably never fully expressed. He carried his father in him like a wound that never entirely closed, the father who built everything he stood on and who he could never quite forgive for having been so great before him. He sat in tents at night, in deserts and mountain passes and river valleys across 3 continents, and read Homer. He read about Achilles and Patroclus, and the rage that had cost so much, and achieved so much, and meant so much. He recognized himself there. The short, brilliant life chosen over the long, quiet one. The glory and its price. The necessity of going forward, even when forward led to the place that burned. He made the world larger in some ways. He opened routes between East and West that had been closed or barely touched. He spread Greek thought and Greek language across territories where they had never penetrated. He enabled a mixing of cultures, a cross-pollination of ideas that gave rise to things he could not have predicted. The Hellenistic kingdoms of his successors, the translation of ancient texts into Greek in Alexandria, the eventual synthesis of Greek philosophy and Semitic religious thought that would shape the intellectual heritage of the Western world for 2,000 years. He also left behind enormous suffering, the cities he sacked, the people he sold into slavery, the men he killed, in battle and in anger and in the calculated brutality of someone who understood that power, without occasional ruthlessness, is not power. The desert march and its thousands of dead. The executions. Clytus with the spear through him. Callisthenes dying in custody. The weight of all of that is real and belongs to the account. History does not simplify. History gives us the whole person, or tries to, and asks us to hold all of it at once. The grandeur and the horror, the vision and the blindness, the love and the violence. The 32-year-old who died in Babylon, having done more in that time than most civilizations do in centuries, and who died, perhaps, because he had never learned how to stop, because the same quality that drove him across the world would not allow him to rest, would not allow him to take the slower road, would not allow him the accommodation with limitation that a longer life might have required. There is something in the story of Alexander that speaks to something in everyone who has ever been driven by ambition, or by curiosity, or by the simple inability to accept that the world is only as large as it currently appears to be. The one who always wants to see what is on the other side of the mountain. The one who cannot be satisfied by what has already been achieved. The one who carries inside them the persistent conviction that there is more, always more, if only they can find it. He found a great deal of it, and the finding cost him everything, but it also gave him something that very few people in history have ever had. The life he chose to live, at the intensity he chose to live it, for the 32 years he was given. Achilles chose the short, glorious life. Alexander, who had read the story of Achilles under a Macedonian sky, with Aristotle explaining the Greek, made the same choice. Whether he knew he was making it, or whether it was simply the only choice he was capable of making, is perhaps the deepest question his story asks. And now, as the story comes to its quiet end, let the images dissolve slowly into each other. The mountains, the rivers, the cities scattered like bright seeds across the map of an ancient world. the fires in the camps at night, the sound of horses, the smell of the sea when an army that has been in the desert for months finally reaches the coast, the library in Alexandria full of books, the tomb, wherever it is now, underneath the streets of a city that still bears his name. Let it all soften. Let it grow quieter. Let the distance between then and now become very gentle and very comfortable. It is a long way from Macedonia to wherever you are tonight. A long way in time, in miles, in every dimension. The world that Alexander moved through is gone. The Persian Empire is gone. The Macedonian kingdom is gone. The Greek city-states are gone. What remains is the story, which is in some ways more durable than any of them. And the story says, a human being can sometimes do things that seem impossible, can cross mountains that seem impassable, can build things that seem too large to be built, can move through the world with a speed and an intensity that leaves everyone else in something between admiration and astonishment, can love deeply and grieve deeply and err deeply and achieve deeply, can be, in one short life, many contradictory things at once, and then can rest. The night is very quiet now. Your breathing is very slow. The story has carried you a long way and will carry you a little further, gently, into the dark country where stories end and sleep begins. Somewhere, in a palace in Babylon, a very tired young man with golden bronze hair and mismatched eyes closed them for the last time and let go of the enormous weight of everything he had been carrying. The campaigns, the plans, the grief for Hephaestion, the guilt for Clytus, the memory of the hyphasis and the tears and the world that lay beyond it, the weight of being who he was, which was enormous, which had been his life's defining burden and his life's defining gift. He let it go, and the men around him who had followed him from Macedonia to the edge of India and back, who had watched him age in a decade from a boy into something ancient and complicated, who had loved him and feared him and been proud of him and been broken by him, those men wept. Ancient sources record that they wept very quietly, not noisily, not with wailing. They simply stood or knelt beside him and wept. Because whatever he was irreplaceable. Whatever he had cost them, they could not imagine the world without him in it. And then the world went on without him, as it always does, as it went on without every extraordinary person who has ever lived. Different, changed, marked by what had happened, but continuing. The world always continues. The nights are long. The stories are told. The stars over Babylon look something like the stars over Macedonia, and the stars over wherever you are tonight look something like both of them, because they are all the same stars, patient and ancient and very far away, looking down on the brief and vivid and extraordinary business of human lives with a steadiness that is something close to tenderness. Rest now. Let the images fade. Let the sounds of an ancient world grow quiet and distant. Let whatever you are carrying tonight become a little lighter. You have walked a long way tonight, across centuries, across continents, through the story of one of the most extraordinary lives ever lived. And now the walking is done. The tent is warm. The stars are out. Somewhere in the distance, very faint, you can almost hear the sound of the river. The great unnamed river that runs through all the stories, through all the nights, carrying everything gently toward the ocean. The ocean that Alexander never reached, that is perhaps still out there, at the edge of the world, patient and wide and full of the particular kind of peace that comes at the end of very long journeys. Let yourself drift toward it now, easily, without effort, without direction, just carried, the way the Tabar was carried, the way all of us are carried through the nights that are too large for us, by something that knows the direction even when we do not. The fire is very low, the night is very deep, and somewhere, in the amber of history, a young man with lion-colored hair sits in his tent with a book, and reads about Achilles, and thinks about the ocean at the edge of the world, and eventually, despite everything, sleeps. As you will sleep now, as you are already sleeping, as the story carries you gently into the deep country of rest, where there are no campaigns, and no limits, and no distances left to cover, where everything has already been achieved, where the world is as large as it needs to be, where the voices are quiet and the images are soft, and the night holds you the way that good nights always hold the people who surrender to them. Gently, warmly, completely. Sleep well.